Hi everyone, Dorst Abrams once again, and my only experience with Nabokov before reading Pale Fire had been with Lolita, a novel I've talked a little bit about on my channel, a novel that I will have to reread in the future for sure. It wasn't my most focused reading experience, but it was a novel that disappointed me in many ways. And I've talked to countless people during the years who love Lolita to bits, who told me it's one of the best novels of the 20th century, but I felt when I was reading it that it felt to me more like some kind of linguistic or philosophical experiment, like some kind of joke about, books not needing a moral or some kind of ethics to support them, rather than a compelling story of any sorts. And when I started Pale Fire, I thought, oh shit, here we go again. This is going to be another kind of linguistic trick, another kind of linguistic experiment. And in a way, Pale Fire is, much more than Lolita, is a literary experiment, a literary game of sorts. In another way, it is utterly, impossibly amazing. It's always weird to me to review, this kind of very famous, very canonical work, highly established, critically praised. It's weird in any possible conception of the term. It's very weird for someone in 2017 to review Pale Fire, but yeah, I need to tell you that Pale Fire is amazing, astonishing, is exactly my kind of shit, and I loved it to bits, and I was laughing out loud multiple times while I was reading it. It was great. Now, Pale Fire has a very peculiar structure, and it would be I would be very interested in discussing with people how they went about, experiencing this kind of structure, which part of the novel they read first. In a novel such as this, that refers to some of its parts multiple times, whether they kept switching between different parts or whether they read it in a linear way. But I'm not going to talk about that, because that will spoil you the fun of experiencing Pale Fire by yourself. Also, I'm firmly convinced that with a book such as this, with such a peculiar structure, the less you know about the structure proper, and the less you hear from people telling you how you should approach it, the best it's going to be for you, because you're going to develop your own experience with the book, and you're going to go about, reading this story and finding out about the many quirks of the narrative yourself. What I'm going to say about it is that it's about a weird, very peculiar character working on a critical work, working on the notes to the poem of a very famous fictional American poet. And what Pale Fire is, first and foremost, starting from its foreword, from its very first page, is a huge joke on criticism and on the excesses and on the self-importance of literary critics. Probably the apex of the, let's say, arrogance of critics is probably Harold Bloom's Anxiety of Influence. There's a passage in that book in which he says that criticism is either literature, it's part of the canon of literature, or it's nothing. And that idea that literary criticism is on the same level with the works it criticizes, it's kind of, a big idea in a way. I'm not sure I agree at all, but at the same time, it's true that the great criticism in literary history, the works of Matthew Arnold, the work of people like Sidney or Dante himself, it's true that has become part of literature itself, of the primary sources. Even Harold Bloom, his works are referenced and influence novels these days. He has become part of the canon. Pale Fire jokes about the excesses of criticism in a hilarious and brilliant way, and begins basically with a guy telling you that, when you approach a poem, first you should read what the critics have to say, so that you will be, you'll be reading the poem with the right set of mind, which is the critics, and then you might experience the actual thing, and then you should go back to the critic so that he can continue instructing you on how you should experience that poem and on the lesson you should get from that piece of literature. This critic, who is also the narrator, sometimes goes to hilarious lengths to make you see and to, you know, convince himself that some element of the poem that maybe does not go together well with his general interpretation actually does mean what he wants it to say, because if you, if you translate this piece into another language, or if you check the original notes about the poem, you can discover this one word that might be meant to say this. This is the kind of, of literary expedient, the kind of trick you sometimes find in some criticism, and it's the kind of thing that makes serious critics cringe, but it's not unheard of in the realm of, literary analysis. At the same time, you shouldn't think that this is simply a book about a guy criticizing and analyzing a poem, and it's just going to be like reading a book of critical literary criticism with some jokes in it. And I'm not going to talk about the plot of the book or about its dynamics and how it relates to the poem, but there is a thrilling and exciting plot in here. A plot about international intrigue, a plot about distant lands, an amazing and rewarding plot. And the greatest thing about this plot, and the greatest thing about the book in general, is that the book gives you so many things. It gives you this plot of international intrigue, it gives you this kind of literary analysis, it talks extensively about the figure of the narrator, of this main character in the novel, but also about the poet that wrote Pale Fire, the poem that is being analyzed in this book. And in a way, it's up to you to decide to interpret the narrator's voice, to interpret up to what point he is reliable or unreliable, whether he is delusional, whether he is batshit crazy, whether he is being completely honest with you and he is simply surrounded by idiots, whether this poem is a genius or a fraud. There's so much stuff you can interpret, and the book lives in this kind of constant uncertainty that if you are a certain kind of reader, if you're the kind of reader that likes this kind of uncertain, self-reflective, open narratives, you can swim inside this book in this eternal uncertainty forever. It's so beautiful and so rewarding. Very simply put, the idea that the narrator of this book, but more than that, Nabokov himself, might be some kind of adventurer and hero or some kind of deranged, crazy person is amazing. And you'll find so many things in the book that support one theory or support another, and making up your own theory is going to be part of the fun. This is another thing that's weird for me to say, coming here in 2017 telling you this, but yeah, Nabokov writes impossibly well, and his style is always so lyrical, and he writes such beautiful sentences, even when he talks about the most disgusting stuff, even when he talks about a guy getting indigestion and needing to go to the toilet plenty of times. He talks about that stuff so beautifully. And of course that adds to the irony of the book and makes it such a rewarding and comical and engaging experience. I really think this is kind of a perfect novel. I do think that I was mind blown by how beautiful this was. The last few paragraphs were simply mind-blowingly beautiful and expanded this whole literary game into the broader world. At the same time, as I mentioned at the beginning and as I repeated now, it is a literary game. It is indeed a game for, people who have some familiarity with literary criticism and with the canon of literature and of poetry and familiarity with the way poetry is discussed in the academia, and many of these jokes have to do with the kind of relationships that are established in an English department at a university. What I'm saying is not necessarily that you have to be an English major or an English professor in order to understand this book. There are books of that sort in around, and American postmodernism produced quite a few of those, but this is not one of them. At the same time, I'm also not saying that I would necessarily suggest it to anyone out there. You'll probably have to be a fan of inventive and quirky and non-linear narratives, and this is not by any means difficult, except that at times Nabokov's style becomes very lyrical and quite complicated, but only in a few passages. At the same time, if you're looking for a linear story and a simple, straightforward narrative, probably don't pick up Pale Fire just now, but still, if you're a dedicated reader, you have to read this book. It's amazing. It's a great example, a great, lo-fi example of the same kind of thing that Dorst and J.J. Abrams will achieve with S 50, 60 years later. S is another kind of literary experiment and quirky novel that works on different levels. I filmed a review about it, but even more than with Pale Fire, the less you know about S, the best it's going to be, and the more rewarding your reading experience is going to be. So just go read both. One last thing, Nabokov's humor in this book felt surprisingly similar to what you later find in the works of people such as Thomas Pynchon and later David Foster Wallace. It's that kind of humor you find extensively in American literature, that kind of humor that mixes highbrow and lowbrow jokes, very earthy themes with the highest of language. And I'm not sure if Nabokov was a direct influence on Pynchon, but there's a kind of urban legend around that when Pynchon was studying at Cornell, he attended a few classes by Nabokov, but couldn't understand him because Nabokov's accent was too thick. Whatever. Anyway, Pale Fire, amazing novel, a masterpiece. Do check it out. I now do want to read Pnin by Nabokov a lot. Let me know if that's another great book and if you think it's worth checking out. I'm sure it is. And let me know what you think about Pale Fire. Thank you for watching this video, guys. I'll see you in the next video. Bye, guys.